When we look at human behavior through the lens of evolutionary psychology, we sort of end up breaking things down into binary patterns of what is a trait characteristic that's going to allow us to be successful and thrive in the world, and what if that behavior becomes maladaptive and turns us into something um, that is less desirable. Um, when we see behavior in lab animals, for example, if we provide a perfect environment for them to live in, to where every need that they have is met, we end up finding evidence that these animals become sullen and depressed, and they involve themselves or engage themselves in homoerotic behavior, but they tend to repel potential um, viable mates. And that shows a similar pattern, I think, um, with human beings. And I think that, as the world gets more, or I guess less adversarial, as far as from a human perspective, I mean, human beings have been around for a long time, but the biggest majority of our time on Earth has been spent, hunting and gathering and, um, trying to create, stability and security for ourselves. Um, by providing for the tribe or for hunting for meat or, building a shelter collectively as people, whatever those endeavors have been. And I think we have it easier in today's world than we have ever had it in human history. And I think that the lack of adversity has a whole other set of problems. And I think that that's why we have a lot of time that we spend that we're anxious and we kind of get angry at each other very easily, and all those other ills of society, if you will, exist because of this lack of adversity. We're not focused on surviving anymore. We end up focusing on other, trivial problems that really don't amount to anything. And I think that that's sort of the maladaptive behavior. But we also see it in people's human sexuality. We see they're less driven to be to create families. They're more driven towards, like I said, homoerotic behavior or autoerotic behavior. And I think that they get sort of caught up in their own solipsistic worlds or worlds of fantasy, um, because it's more soothing to them than going through all the work of trying to create and maintain an actual healthy relationship. So that's just a little bit of a random thought today. I just was sitting here thinking about that, and how, this is not meant to be derogatory towards anyone's, preferences or lifestyle. It's just an observation from sort of a clinical point of view, through the lens of evolutionary psychology. The other maladaptive behaviors is one that Professor Gad Sad talks about a little bit, is something called suicidal empathy. And I think that that's when, what it comes down to is that there's a band, a region that goes kind of across the top of your brain. It's called the somatosensory cortex, and that area of the brain controls a lot of how emotional we are, in a lot of ways, how we respond to emotional stimulation. And I think that some people just have a lot more active somatosensory cortex than other people, and I think that that's a big reason why they tend to be more liberally minded, maybe, or more altruistically inclined. I think that those things are very closely related somehow. I think that there are good trait indicators, uh, you know, uh, behavioral or personality trait characteristics that align pretty closely with, um, the ideology that people follow. So conservative people tend to be, more more closed. They're more they're not as open. They're more closed as people go. They're not necessarily as outgoing or as open to experience. As they're more traditional in their values. They're focused more on um, the values of the family and security, and just making sure that there's order in the universe. Orderliness is a big one. Um, and sort of doing everything they can to keep chaos at bay, and creating a social sort of network to help in that to a degree, but less so than more liberal people who tend to be much more open and open to experience, but tend to be less score lower in trait conscientiousness. So conservatives are very conscientious people, but they're less open, and conservatives are less conscientious and they're more open. And that pretty well sums that up. But the sometimes what happens is what I like to call the crazy cat lady syndrome. My friend Leon came up with that, the crazy cat lady syndrome, because what happens is people get so fixated on fixing the problem that they end up becoming part of the problem. And Carl Jung sort of hit it on that. He used to talk about this in some of his writings. He used the word, it's a difficult word to say, so you have to bear with me, but an antiodromia. And an angiodromia is anything's sort of propensity to become its opposite. So he talked about it in regards to the shadow, um, and we can talk about it in the world of physics, in the form of degradation or you know the breakdown of something over time, the degradation of its value, um, entropy, I think they call that. So uh, we have to be careful that we don't become the thing that we are most afraid of, or the thing that we're trying to alleviate in the world. So, as I'm not a religious person, but I do look to the Tao to some degree, and I find comfort in that. For some reason, I started into that maybe in the early '90s. I discovered that some more Benjamin Hoff's famous book, The Tao of Pooh. I'm trying to think. Yeah, I read a book, Dan Millman, The Way of the Peaceful Warrior. That was big then. That was kind of a hip thing back in the early '90s for all the New Age people. But yeah, so anyways, like I said, this is just going to be random thoughts and sort of the diarrhea of the mouth here. So, anyways, thanks for listening.